This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is Professor Emerita of Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her most recent book, Figuring Jerusalem, Poetics and Poetics in the Sacred Center, was published last year by University of Chicago Press and has just won the National Jewish Book Award. Professor Sidra DeKoven Ezrahi, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
That's great. So I'd like to start with the phrase in the title, Politics and Poetics, because the book is essentially about the tension between the two, that Jerusalem is an idea as well as a place, and vice versa, a place as well as an idea.
The poet Auden famously said in his poem In Memoriam to Yeats, poetry makes nothing happen. And that's probably as true now as it was in Homer's time. So we don't necessarily assume that our poets and those who read and study and are influenced by poetry are going to make a huge difference in the world. But I think if the politicians would read my book, they might understand that they have been actually misreading their own sources, including poetic sources, for many, many years.
The fact that you assume that they have read them is something to start with.
Well, I'm talking about sources that I would say most of the people who are currently in the Israeli government are at least familiar with, such as the Book of Genesis. They either studied it in school, or if they went to yeshiva or whatever. But I have a very, very different reading of some of the very classical texts. And the first part of the book really considers texts like The Binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, which I read as a comedy. So I'm obviously reading it against the grain of what most people have assumed this. It's not just what the story is, it's how it's been used and how it's been appropriated to signify Jewish martyrdom over the years. Same with Song of Songs and also the Rambam Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed.
Why these three?
Good question. Because there are personal reasons that I won't go into. It has to do with my own affinity for these texts, but it also has to do with, I think that these are among the building blocks of Jewish civilization and of Jewish experience. And when I say Jewish, it's obviously the civilization that was founded after the destruction of the temple, the so-called Second Temple, which was really a third temple, but by the Romans in the first century of the Common Era. And it took a few centuries for something that we understand as Judaism to evolve. But it was a religion that was based on distance from the sacred center. And the diaspora or galut or whatever we call it evolved all over the world with the Bible at the center and with some kind of idea of a return to Zion at the center of everyone's attention. And that was true in prayer, that was true in literature, in liturgy. But at the same time, what was being created were simulacra. That is, a synagogue is called a mikdash ma'at to this day, mikdash ma'at, a little temple. The prayers were meant to substitute for sacrifice. Everything that evolved in Judaism was, in a way, a form of substitution, a form of simile, if you will. And it was the poetic imagination that flourished, along with some gesture towards return. But it was the Rambam and others who taught us, she'af al pi sheyitma mea ani ma'amin, that not just that even though the Messiah tarries, I will believe in him, but because the Messiah tarries. This is an ever-tarrying Messiah.
Yeah. So the return to the Holy Land, to Zion,
Right.
to Jerusalem, was
Right.
actually an undoing of that.
Well,
and
not-
so I want to,
Okay.
before you contend,
Yeah.
I'd like to say, how do you think that the current politicians today, who are perhaps carrying out this mission in the way they see fit, and even the predecessors in the Zionist leaders along the last century or so, why is their reading of these sources mistaken?
Well, first of all, I think when we talk about return to Zion, this genie was let out of the bottle only after 1967, because for the first half century of Zionism, and even the first 20 years after the establishment of the state, Jerusalem was out of our control. So we maintained the same practices, whether it was in prayer or poetry or whatever that we had established over 2,000 years. And even in 1967, and even after that, for a long time, there was some kind of an idea of, a universal religious space. That was something that Rabin had very much fostered, along with King Hussein. It was only really after Begin, and then if you move through to Netanyahu's time, and the growth of the settler youth and their claims to the Holy Land. This was something that was new in Judaism, and was an attempt at some kind of a throwback, but it's a completely new phenomenon.
It is interesting, though, because there is some sort of a return to the previous stage, in the sense that perhaps the current leaders, the messianic ones who are now in government, are now talking about rebuilding the temple and, for a better word, ethnically cleansing Jerusalem of non-Jews, and other such ideas, are ironically also imagining Jerusalem as some sort of a metaphor for their own needs, but they don't take it for what it is: a city, a concrete and tangible place where people just live their lives.
Absolutely. I don't think they're taking it as a metaphor. I think that what they feel is that they are compelled, they're somehow commanded to go back to the most primitive form of pre-Jewish existence. It's something that we've never seen, certainly not for the last 2,000 years. There was a wonderful film called Me'agadat HaChurban about the destruction of the Second Temple, and it feels very, very relevant to today.
So is your book, in a way, a study in Jewish fundamentalism?
No, because what I'm doing, the assumption is as I said, the assumption is that Judaism evolved at a distance from the sacred. Judaism evolved as a religion of simulacra, of all kinds of gestures towards Jerusalem, without the appropriation of some kind of primitive forms of worship.
It's interesting because you did tell me before that this idea was gestating for about 20 years before you actually wrote the book and published it. Yeah. So it's not like you're living up to some political fad at the moment. It's not a political manifesto per se.
I could not, in my wildest nightmares, have anticipated how relevant this book would be when it came out, because what I was doing in this book actually was engaging with the texts that are most precious to me, the biblical texts, the medieval texts, Moreh Nevochim, and the two authors of Jerusalem, the two modern authors of Jerusalem, Agnon and Amichai, who are most precious to me, but also whose stance vis-a-vis Jerusalem is, I think, very, very revealing. So I had no conscious political agenda. it's only as I was finishing the book, I'm happy to read actually from a passage, if that's
Please. Sure.
that I wrote just as the book was being was being finished. This is the end of the prologue, and this section is called The Wailing Wall. I wrote the last draft of this book during the coronavirus lockdown of the spring of 2020, when the plaza in front of the Wailing Wall was devoid of its usual crowds. Yet the empty space revealed a profound truth. As with all religious shrines, what has made this site holy is the procession of worshipers over the centuries who have desperately poured out their hearts and their prayers. It became sacred not because of the presence of divine grandeur, but by the accumulation of human pathos. No one put it better than Mark Twain in his irreverent version of One Pilgrim's Progress. Towards the end of Innocents Abroad, after visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, he allowed his Protestant American skepticism to fall away briefly in the face of the generations that have sanctified the place. For 1,500 years, its shrines have been wet with the tears of pilgrims from the earth's remotest confines, quote unquote. Imagining the wall, wailing in its loneliness, provided me with a forlorn hope that we too might yet learn something about how to heal the wounds at the center of our being, though that is not likely to happen in my lifetime. The final editing of these pages was accompanied once again by the noise of war, as unrest in the Sheikh Jarrah area of East Jerusalem bled into the violence on, where else? The Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, which led to hostilities between Hamas in Gaza and the Israeli military. And of course, we've just seen a repeat of that. As I write these words, it appears that the oldest fraternal rivalry in the monotheistic world shows no sign of abating, and that the world's most precious 37 acres of real estate may always remain the site of ultimate sacrifice. Now, I want to again emphasize what Jews forget and Christians helped us to forget, which is that Isaac was not sacrificed. We forget that because in the wars with the Christians and in our own need for some kind of a sign of martyrdom, all the different piyutim and all the different, the various comments upon Isaac's binding basically sacrifice him. And we forget that he wasn't sacrificed. We forget that he was saved. It's true that he becomes very quiet afterwards and probably suffers from some form of PTSD, but Abraham was not sacrificed. And that lesson is one of the lessons that we have forgotten.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about the structure of the book. It starts, as we said, with a discussion of those three canonical texts. Okay, that it's the Binding of Isaac from Genesis, Song of Songs, and A Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides, and then goes to discuss two modern 20th century writers, also perhaps two of the greatest Israeli writers, Agnon and the poet Yehuda Amichai. Can you explain that trajectory, both in terms of the hermeneutical as well as the temporal process?
Yeah, sure. Well, I chose the Akedah and Song of Songs for a number of reasons, both because I think they've been misread. And when I tried, for instance, when I was teaching at the university and I would teach Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, I had to instruct my students to do something which was almost impossible, even for those who had not graduated from religious institutions. And that was, please read these texts without the midrashic voices in your head. So for instance, Song of Songs, okay? Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim Asher LeShlomo, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, right? Solomon, what did Solomon do? What do we remember him having done more than anything else? He built the temple, right? There's no mention of a temple in a poem which takes place in Jerusalem, which is Solomon's. Just as an example. But what the rabbis do is they put the temple back in. So the love bower between the Shulamit and her lover becomes the anteroom to the temple, and so on. And so we have to somehow rid ourselves of these voices in order to go back to these texts. Same thing with the Akedah. It's not just that we forget that he wasn't sacrificed. The Akedah, I read it as a comedy. It's full of laughter. Isaac doesn't laugh, but even though his name Yitzchak means laughter,
neither
right?
does the ram.
Well, the ram, yes, and Amichai has a wonderful poem about that. But Abraham laughs. Sarah laughs. Sarah is doubled up with laughter. And she has an exchange with God where God says, "Why did you laugh?" And she says, "I didn't laugh." He says, "Oh, yes, you did." And I mean, one can really ham that up. I'm trying to tease out of these texts something which is just there, but we have forgotten to see it. And I'm not the only one. I don't want to claim this kind of a discovery, but I'm one of the few voices. The Rambam is different. The Moreh Nevuchim, the whole book is really about the use of metaphor in the description of the Godhead, and how and what is the most important thing for Maimonides is to make the point that God is not corporeal, and that these prophets and poets are using images because that's the way humans speak. Dibra Torah b'lishon b'nei Adam. But that we shouldn't assume that God has an outstretched arm, or that God has an angry nose, or whatever. And what I'm arguing also in the second half of the book is that both Agnon and Amichai, but particularly Agnon, are actually in conversation with the Rambam in his writing. That there's a kind of understanding of the lure and the danger of certain kind of language.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, actually, what I think I'd like to do is to, if I may, talk about Agnon a little bit in terms of because I look at three different stories. Two of them that his most canonic. The two stories are Agunot and Agadat HaSofer, and his most his great achievement, Tmol Shalshom, only yesterday. And what I'm arguing is that the temptation of each of these characters, particularly in the short stories, is to come close to the sacred in some ways, and how dangerous it is, how dangerous that act is. So in Agunot, which is his signature story, he took his name Agnon from the story itself, which means, as you know, women who have not been able to divorce their husbands. It's a love story about a young man who is brought to be, he's a craftsman, and he's brought to make an Aron Kodesh for the Sefer Torah, and he falls in love with Dinah, and she falls in love with him. But in the course of making this Aron Kodesh, this vessel for the Torah scroll, he actually falls more and more in love with his art. And in the end, the end is tragic. The same thing happens in Agadat HaSofer, the tale of the scribe. Raphael is a scribe who writes Sifrei Torah for women who have died childless. In the meantime, he's completely neglecting his own wife, who dies childless. And so his final act is to write a Sefer Torah in her memory. But she dies childless because the human love that was offered him has been scorned in favor of his holy action. And it's this temptation of coming close to the sacred and ignoring the holiness of the human in front of you that I think is Agnon's big story.
How do they echo Maimonides?
Well, they echo Maimonides because I think that what is at the center of Maimonides' whole oeuvre is the understanding that language itself is just a human tool, and that we have to make sure that we don't try to get close to the divine, because the divine is everywhere. Melo kol haaretz kvodo. The divine is not confined to a place. I mean, it's even in the Bible. When King Solomon says to God, he's very proud, and he says to God, I had a beautiful home, and now I've built you a home, or he's about to build a home, and God says, no. He doesn't say no, but he says, Tivne bayit lishmi, build a house to my name. And what I understand is that this is the house of prayer, any house of prayer from which human prayers can go up to the divine. It's all over.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting that you focus on these two modern authors, both Agnon and Amichai, because they embodied in their own life story this very 20th century Jewish story, in the fact that they were both born in Europe, Agnon in Ukraine, in today's Ukraine, and Amichai in Germany, and came to Palestine as young men and became these canonic writers of Jerusalem. And in many ways, what you're saying, and I think that our listeners might also detect that American accent of yours, because you have your own biography as well, that, it's really this tension between a diasporic existence and a rooted existence in the land of Israel, from which all these issues emerge.
I think that's very perceptive, okay? And if it's okay, I'd like to begin the way the book I'd like to respond to you by reading a poem that Amichai wrote, which I think relates to that. And that has to do with how do we navigate the spaces, let's call it the secular space from which we came, and the holy space of Jerusalem. So I'll read it in Hebrew and then I'll read it in English. למה ירושלים? למה לא בבל עם מגדל בבל ושפות רבות? למה לא רומא עם הקטקומבות? למה לא מכה עם האבן השחורה? למה לא ונקובר עם דגי הסלומון שעולים אליה מן הים וזוחלים על גחונם במעלה ההר הקשה, כמו עולי רגל מחפרים, עולי סנפיר וקסקסת, והם מגיעים למרום ומשריצים ומתים. Why of all places Jerusalem? Why not Babylon with her Tower of Babel and her babbling tongues? Why not Rome with her catacombs? Why not Mecca with her black stone? Why not Vancouver with her salmon that ascends to her from the sea, crawling on their bellies up the hard mountain slope? Like atoning pilgrims, kosher pilgrims of fin and scale that arrive at the blue heights, spawn, and die. I think that last line, spawn and die, actually carries all of the nuances, and I think that what Amichai is putting his finger on here, as in so much of his poetry, I don't want to call it a death wish on the part of many Jews and Israelis. It's a sense of arrival and culmination, and eschatology, which is actually very, as I'm trying to say, very foreign to Judaism if we look at the classical texts. But it's very, very enticing.
What does
I want to answer you about Agnon too, if I may.
Please.
I think Agnon, particularly in his person, much more than Amichai, I think, even though I feel very strongly about what I said, and I spent a lot of time on his magnum opus, and I don't think there's time for me to elaborate. But I think after 1967, in the 3 years between the 1967 war and his death, Agnon himself was very ambivalent about about proximity to the sacred. According to his biographer, he did not actually approach the Kotel after during the period, as I say, from 67 to 70. And I think that you see also in his writing a kind of ambivalence. Amichai is different. Amichai lived till 2000, just before the Second Intifada. He died. And he understood the dangers. But he also created a kind of poetics of dialogue, poetics of hyphen, as my colleague Hannah Kronfeld calls it, hamakaf, which is the sort of the vis-a-vis of human beings. And that includes Arabs and Jews, and that includes lovers. There's always both a kind of appreciation for the other, but also the distance between two individuals and between the self and the sacred.
And I think also one of the rhetorical tools that he certainly used, as we've just heard in that poem, and of course Agnon is very famous for, and what you just said about Akedat Yitzchak is also, it all ties in very nicely, is irony and humor.
Very good. Yeah, I appreciate that. And my argument about Agnon's great opus, Tmol Shalshom, only yesterday, and I think I'm the only one to argue this, is that actually underneath the tragedy, because Yitzchak Kumer dies of rabies, right, at the end, and you can say that that the whole structure is a tragic structure. I'm arguing that underneath the tragedy is the comedy, and that he actually lived a very fulfilled life, Yitzchak Kumer, but at the very end, in a way, the mandate of the Akedah was just too great, and he died in this hideous way. But there's a great deal of humor. There's a great deal of human decency, of compassion.
So is this tragic comedy, this gallows humor that also emerged in Why Jerusalem in the Amichai poem, is it really a sort of perhaps a representation of that distance from the sacred? You are attracted to it, but at the same time you're repelled from it.
I don't think I'd call it gallows humor. This is not the humor of people who are, on their way to the gallows.
I think Isaac escaped it narrowly.
That's true. And I read this as a comedy, as I say, for two reasons, because it's Deus Ex Machina comes, right? And that's the classical definition of comedy is tragedy that is averted at the last minute. Okay, that's the tragedy. But also, the references in the story itself, and I recommend all of our listeners to go back, or viewers to go back and read the Akedah, the 5 chapters around the Akedah, Genesis 17 to 22. The word sachok appears in one form or another to laugh 20 times, right? And so it's a motif, and one has to pay attention to that if one is, serious about sort of a literary approach to to the classical texts.
And going back to today's politics in Jerusalem, as you say, it's really different from, or a real aberration from everything that these texts have taught us. I mean, we seem to be going in a steady direction for a very long time now. I mean, away from the legacy of these texts into a different kind of, let's say, a Jewish, well, I don't know if ideology is really the word, but a set of ideas. Where do you see, do you see at all, like a way out of this of this mess?
It's too easy almost to become apocalyptic, really. And I think that because we commemorate often the destruction of the temples, it's very easy to imagine the destruction of the whole enterprise, which would bring. I mean, it would bring Armageddon. the people who are so intent on rebuilding the temple were, God forbid, to blow up the mosques, the entire Arab world would be upon us, and it would be apocalyptic. Obviously, as I say,
But even if we avert that, in the more likely scenario, I would say, still, this kind of ideology is seeping into our understanding of who we are and what Judaism is and what Israeliness is. And if I understand your analysis correctly, this process, this corrosion, is destructive. I mean, we have, as Israelis, as Jews, as Israeli Jews, have in one way or another to reinvent ourselves.
So, it's interesting. We're sitting in Tel Aviv, and I live in, Medinat Yerushalayim, which so many people who live in Tel Aviv, and this has been going on, as you know, for years and years, they won't even step foot in Jerusalem. They don't have any connection to it. And that's why this government and all of its edicts are coming as such a surprise. I think for many of us who lived in Jerusalem, it's less surprising. It's terrifying, but it's less surprising.
Because you've been living with it for some time.
Yes, because of the fact that, the yeshiva students are studying the Talmud. They're not even reading Bible. When they say they're studying Torah, they're reading the Talmud. And the Talmud is telling them that the Song of Songs is actually, they're not even allowed to read the Song of Songs. They read Shir HaShirim Rabbah, which basically tells them that, this represents the temple and that represents it. And that's what they've learned. And I feel, I want to believe that the kinds of texts that we're looking at, that I'm looking at, will still reverberate in another 100 years, another 200 years, in the classrooms, in the universities. It feels like we're living through very dire times, and we don't really know how this is going to play out. But I do believe, as I said in this book, that the politics and the poetics are very, very tightly enmeshed.
And I'm still waiting for a bottom line here, or something resembling a bottom line.
I don't have a bottom line because I think we're all sort of holding our breath.
Mm-hmm.
The bottom line is, that if the politicians would read my book, they would understand. They would come to their senses. They would understand that they've been misreading their texts, and that there's another way, which is humane, which is inclusive, which is compassionate, and that there's another way to do it. Jacques Derrida said something about separating the sacred hearth, the sacred fire of the temple from the hearth of the home. And we've confused all that. I wonder if I could read Amichai's poem, Singer of the Song of Songs, since we've mentioned the Song of Songs. This was one of his last poems. The singer of the Song of Songs sought his beloved so long and hard that he lost his mind and went looking for her with a simile map and fell in love with the images he himself had imagined. He went down to Egypt, for he had written, "To a mare among Pharaoh's chariots I compare thee." And he went up to Gilad to see her flowing hair, for he had written, "Thy hair is like a flock of goats flowing down Mount Gilead." And he went up to the Tower of David, for it says, "Like the Tower of David is thy neck." And he got as far as Lebanon and found no peace, for it says, "Thy nose is like the Tower of Lebanon that looks out toward Damascus." And he dashed off to the desert, for it says, "Who is that rising from the desert like pillars of smoke?" And the Bedouin thought he was one of the crazy prophets, and he thought he was King Solomon. And he is still wandering, a fugitive and a vagabond with the mark of love on his forehead. And sometimes he happens upon the loves of other couples in other times. He even got as far as our home, with its broken roof on the border between Jerusalem and Jerusalem. And we never even saw him, because we were in each other's arms. He is still wandering, shouting, "You are beautiful, my bride," as if from within a deep sack of oblivion. And whoever wrote, "Love is as fierce as death," he understood his own simile only at the end, understood and loved and died. The metaphor blew up with its meaning. In Hebrew, it's hanimshal hitpotzets im hamashal. Oh, hamevin yavin, right? It's even Solomon, who can't see the love that's right under his nose.
Mm-hmm. What do you think Amichai would have made of Jerusalem today?
I think he would have made more of what he made of it. I think he saw it all. I really do. I mean, he was so saddened by what was happening. And this was, 23 years ago he died.
Yeah, it was a very different time. I mean, much less desperate than it is today.
Less desperate, but he could see it. I mean, he wasn't a prophet, but he could see what was happening.
So in a way, it's inescapable, isn't it? I mean, you're suggesting in a way to roll back that very recent history. But I don't know if, given the situation of some sort of like a national rebirth, Jewish rebirth in the land of Israel, in Jerusalem proper. I mean, as you said, the 67 fault line was between sovereignty over Jerusalem, the lack of sovereignty over Jerusalem and sovereignty over it. I mean, if we ask, we Jews, we Israelis are to be sovereign of Jerusalem, there's very little alternative what we're seeing now. I mean, it's basically like a person with, coming to El Dorado, with this huge fortunes. And Sidra DeKoven Ezrahi is asking that person, please stay away from all that gold.
I think that's a wonderful analogy in a way, because the attraction of the sacred center, I mean, it really is a kind of gravitational pull that it has on we're having this conversation at a very dire moment. I want to believe that maybe within the next couple of months things will change for the better. Obviously, the protest movement is vibrant and it's not going away, and it encompasses so many people. I want to believe that my young colleagues at the Hebrew University and the students who are coming up will be able to read these texts with the freedom that I brought to these texts, that I'm inviting them to bring to these texts and all the other texts. We don't know that, do we? We're lucky not to be able to project the future. But it's a very serious moment. And it didn't have to be that way. I really do believe if Rabin had not been assassinated, we would be in a very different place, because a very short time before he was assassinated, he and King Hussein were already preparing for the city of Jerusalem to be a shared city. Mm-hmm. It didn't have to, Haya יכול להיות אחרת, as we say.
In the absence of that, all we can do is read Figuring Jerusalem, the award-winning book by Professor Sidra DeKoven Ezrahi. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And many thanks to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please write us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like probably close to 1,000 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.